1987, University of Minnesota ME grad, and funny enough, I sort of got into the stuff I'm going to talk about today because I was planning to be a computer science grad, and somebody talked me out of it. So instead of doing computer science, I went into the next thing I next most appreciated, which was mechanical engineering. So I've kind of always been at the intersection of computers and engineering and so forth, and that's probably what led me to this talk here today. My wife does have a bachelor's, master's, and PhD from the ME program here at the U as well. I met her at school. Okay, so what happened here is that Professor Michael Porter, who's a very famous professor, one of the most famous in the world, quite frankly, the most famous at Harvard Business School, for some time was on our board of directors. And when I was advocating, he's not now, but when I was advocating to the board why we had to change our strategy and why I wanted to make some acquisitions and do some crazy sounding things, I was saying things that really was piquing Michael's attention. I said, for example, products are going to begin to interact with their value chains. And you'll see in a minute that the term value chain was invented by Michael Porter. That was a 1987 paper he wrote, and we'll actually visit that framework a bit here today. But he said, Jim, you're saying things that sort of challenge some of my writings, and if somebody's going to obsolete my writings, it's going to be me. So let's go work on this together and see what we come up with. So we did a big research project, and it was published. We have a second one we've written up, and we have a slot in the September 2015 Harvard Business Review on the second article, and I'll have some of that content in here as well, so we'll point that out when we get there. The second article looks at more how do companies change when they change from making traditional products to smart products. How does that change their organizational structure, their business processes, and things like that? Okay, but basically the thesis of our work was that there has been 3 waves now of disruptive change from information technology into business. If you go back to the far left, for a long time, hundreds of years, there was no information technology, and products were physical things. Information lived on paper and cabinets, was carried from person to person, and so forth. And then really when computers came on the scene in the 1960s, 70s, and beyond, we had electronic data processing and then information technology departments and so forth, and we began to automate business processes in the value chain with information flow. And there was a big productivity wave. And then that settled down a bit, and then come late 90s, let's say, the internet came along, and that was another big wave, because suddenly the reach of information technology was such that you could go not just within a department, but across departments and across companies. You could involve suppliers and customers, and you could go global very easily and so forth. And that played itself out to a certain degree, but we think now that putting IT into products themselves is another big disruptive change that is coming fast and hard right now. And to put in perspective the level of interest out there, earlier this week we at PTC had a customer gathering of our IoT customers and interested prospective customers in Boston. Last year this event drew 325 people. This year we planned for 1,000. We realized we were going to overrun that plan. We looked around, found a bigger auditorium 3 blocks away that could hold 2,100. When we got oversubscribed to the 2,100, we opened up an internet live stream for the keynotes and so forth. That could hold 5,000 people, and that got tapped out. So we ended up from 325 last year to more than 7,000 this year, in 1 year's time. So I think that speaks to the interest in this phenomenon and maybe to some progress we're making. Okay, so let's start with the basic idea that things are changing, and that's a play on word. But if you look at this piece of farm equipment, and this is sort of loosely modeled after John Deere. Some years ago, John Deere made products that were purely mechanical. Then along the way, software snuck into them in engine control units and in dashboard displays and so forth. At some point, John Deere said, well, that tractor, if you squint and look at it, is kind of a computer. Why don't we give it an IP address and connect it to the internet? And that was sort of the third phase. Then they got into this idea that products could actually work together, not just be independently smarter and more capable, but be collectively smarter and more capable, and that's this notion we call a product system. So for example, I'm a Minnesota farm boy, by the way. So information could be gathered from your harvesting equipment when you're harvesting the wheat or the oats or corn or whatever in the fall. And for each little parcel of land, you could make a record, by combining geolocation with measurement of harvesting productivity. you could create a map of how productive the different parts of your land were. And you could store that in the cloud. And then next spring when it came time to plant, first thing you got to do is turn the soil over, and there's usually an injection of fertilizer into the soil. Well, you could use both variable amounts of fertilizer and precision location of the fertilizer. Rather than broadcasting the same amount of fertilizer everywhere, why don't we vary the fertilizer according to last year's productivity? If the land was highly productive, it probably doesn't need that much. If it was not very productive, it probably needs a little more. And then we could also put it, for example, in thin strips, if we knew that when we came along with the planter, we could land the seeds right in those same strips. So by sharing this database in the sky between the harvesting equipment, the planting equipment, the tilling equipment, and the tractors, you actually could get much more productivity out of that same piece of land with less fertilizer input and so forth. So that's an interesting idea. By the way, to me, that's what Apple does with iPads, iPods, iMacs, iPhones, and so forth. They're part in the cloud, but the part that's in the cloud is shared. So if you download a song or an app to this device, pretty soon it shows up on that device too, because that's kind of a common digital presence, if you will. Now, you take that idea and you just go crazy with it. In this concept we call systems of systems, and you get smart cities and smart farms and smart all kinds of things, where you're just connecting many different things together, sort of almost like random collections of things. For example, things in a factory. You can make a factory run much more efficient by regulating the speed of one thing according to how well the thing that's, let's say, downstream from it is performing and so forth. So in the case of John Deere, you know, they actually have 3 businesses like this now. They have one for farming, one for construction equipment, and one, for forestry equipment. The problem is, when they're over here, they run into Monsanto as a competitor. And they say to Monsanto, what are you doing here? You don't even make tractors. And Monsanto says, what does this have to do with tractors? I make fertilizers and seeds, and it's got as much to do with fertilizer and seeds as it does to tractors. What are you doing here? So anyway, it's a kind of a slippery slope, and some companies are outrunning their supply line because they end up competing with people who don't make stuff but just integrate it. But it's a very interesting phenomenon. We found dozens of companies who are sliding down this slope with ever bigger strategies that you know, in the end may or may not work. Okay, so what we said is if you take a look at one of those pieces of equipment, one tractor, for example, it now has a technology stack that I like to say is part digital, part physical. It's part client, it's part server, and it's part on-premise, and it's part in the cloud, all at the same time. It's a pretty interesting and complex piece of technology, because that tractor still has a lot of heavy iron in it, the hardware. It's got a lot of software, more and more software every day in the tractor. But now that tractor is like a client connected over a network to a server, which may be a shared server shared by all the tractors of that model, or all the tractors of all the models, or all the tractors on this farm, or what have you. In that model in that cloud is a big data database that's gathering streams from all the tractors or all the whatever things are connected. There tends to be an application platform, and the reason there's a platform here is because when people start thinking about what could I do with that data, they come up with dozens and then hundreds of ideas, and so they start saying I should have some reusable plumbing. There's a big need for rules and analytic engines. So simple rules, what I call little data analytics, would be like if the engine temperature is too high, you know, if temp greater than boiling, then a problem, right? That's simple rules. But the big data analytics stuff is very interesting, because there you're looking at all these sensor streams coming by, and you're starting to do statistical analysis of the sensor streams and trying to find correlations to events you care about. For example, a certain pattern of vibration, and then maybe a change in heat signature might indicate that within a week the engine's going to fail if you don't intervene and act on that problem. So you don't even necessarily know why. Like, why does that set of sensor readings you know, precede this problem? I'm not sure why, but in the meantime I know it does. So every time I see that sensor reading, I'm going to trigger an alert, and I'm going to send a service technician out there, and maybe at night when the tractor's not being used, you know, it probably isn't a tractor, but when the thing is not being used, we'll intervene. And then lots of people are developing lots of applications on those ideas. And then on the left side, you know, there's lots of need for security kind of thinking, and on the right side, there's lots of other sources of information that can be mapped in. So in the smart farm, you might want to map in the weather forecasts, you might want to map in the, you need geolocation data from satellites, etc. And then, of course, you might want to tie into your business systems, ERP and CRM type things, and stuff like that. So we would say that this is, from this point forward, the technology stack that products are moving to. And I don't know what comes after this, but I know that everything's headed this way. It's a simplification. If you want something published in Harvard Business Review, it has to be not too complex. So it's a simplification, but pretty good model that I think has stood up to a lot of scrutiny. Okay, so just for fun, I want to talk a little bit more about this convergence of digital and physical. So now I'm off the paper on a bit of a tangent. So PTC here has been helping companies with computer-aided design forever. And we had a big demonstration of this for real, but I'll give you the PowerPoint version. So let's say you designed a bicycle. And this happens to be a bicycle from Santa Cruz Bicycles. It's a downhill carbon fiber, racing mountain bike. Pretty intense to watch a race on a bike like that. So you take the digital prototype, and it's all digital, and it's easy to change. So you tweak it and you simulate, and when you get it where you think it should be, you hand it off to the factory, all that digital information. And the factory says, okay, I'll make a physical version of that bike. So at this point, digital and physical are different. They're very different. In fact, we're kind of actually done with the prototype at this point. You got the bike. Prototype doesn't mean anything anymore. You can throw it in the trash can. We'll probably keep it in case we want to make a slightly different bike later. It'd be easier to start from this one. But for all intents and purposes, that digital prototype is spent. So now we take the physical bike, and that process of converting from digital to physical, if you can make it small enough and automated enough, you'd call it a 3D printer. So to me, factories and 3D printers are the same thing. It's just a question of scale and process. Okay, what we show people is, what if you took that bike after the fact and added even aftermarket sensors to it? So in our real demonstration, we did this. We purchased 7 sensors off Amazon.com. We took a Raspberry Pi, we made a little harness, duct taped the harness onto the bike, and started riding the bike. And said, well, what can we do with that? Well, now we can hook that digital world back into that physical bike back into the digital world. For example, we have a technology called ThingWorks. There are other ways to do it. But we have a technology called ThingWorks that will allow you to connect it, and then, for example, on your computer or on your smartphone or tablet, you could have a dashboard, and it's a little hard to see this, but there's numbers here, and as somebody's riding that bike, the numbers are changing in the dashboard and so forth. And there's lots of places you can go with monitoring like that. So we at PTC were playing and said, playing around with some ideas. What if we took the stream of data coming from the bike into the dashboard and we fed it back into the CAD model? That would be kind of interesting, because then the model would be a prototype. It would be an avatar. And so this brings us to a kind of interesting idea here that we call digital twin. We borrowed that term from NASA, by the way, where physical things have a digital avatar that can experience the same phenomenon that the physical thing experiences and collect over time, accumulate the same wear, tear, stress experience that the physical thing collects. And so now this digital twin, while the bike's running the race, this CAD model could run the race too, and then you get something like this. So those arrows there are reaction forces calculated using the dynamics calculation engines within the bicycle. So we could actually run that race both physically and digitally at the same time, review the digital model and say that bike's way over engineered. We didn't come close to any kind of dangerous stress levels, frame's too heavy, we should go back and tweak the design again. And then we might even record that race, and before we even bother running another race, we'll take the digital model and the derivative model and run the race again and see if that makes sense. So you see, actually this will affect, amongst other things, the way engineers work, and the ability to test, not simulate, because it's kind of part real. What I say, it's not simulation, it's enlightenment, because it's real at the same time that it's sort of being simulated. And then we said, okay, now you've got this bike that went from digital to physical, back to digital. Could we take this enlightened idea and bring it back into the field with us, back to the bike, for purposes of servicing it or something like that? And that brings us to an idea we call augmented reality. So we're looking at that bike now through an iPad, and you can't see it that well, but you will hear it better. And we've augmented onto that bicycle a dashboard. And we've got some warning signs that the wheels are turning at different speeds, so we're in slip indicator, we've got RPM gauges, angular gauges, stress vectors, reactionary forces projected right onto the bike and so forth. So we've just kind of taken it back again into the physical world. So we went digital, physical again. It's interesting, fun stuff, because I think that you can imagine a world, for example, there's a generator. What do I know about it? Well, let me point my tablet at it, and it tells me all kinds of stuff. turns on X-ray vision, and I can see where the engine is, and I'm supposed to replace the oil filter, and there's a vibration pattern that the analytics suggest would indicate a motor cushion has failed, and I should go replace that motor cushion. You know, like those rubber hockey puck things has failed, perhaps split and fallen out. I should go face that. I get the generator and serial number and last maintained date, some other analytics and so forth. You could take that next. Here's another little fun video for what should I do to it. So here we've turned on X-ray vision. We see the hydraulic system, which we always knew was there in the digital world. And now we turn that into, you know, how would I go ahead and make a repair in terms of a work instruction for that machine with that problem. Now, we didn't just invent augmented reality. It's been here for actually a long time. But it was never so practical because you couldn't augment against me because you didn't know anything about me. But if I'm wearing Fitbits and quantified self-type stuff and I'm connected to the internet and your augmentation software is also connected to the internet and running the analytics and so forth, I could walk in the doctor's office, the doctor could do this and say, Jim, you know, you're 10 pounds overweight and you haven't been exercising. What's the problem? I told you. I told you to do that. Right? I mean, it's an interesting kind of sort of new world of possibilities out there. So coming back to the HBR paper, that was a little tangent. Coming back to the HBR paper, we said, well, why would you bother connecting something to the internet? We developed this framework that said, well, at the first level you could monitor. You'd know what's going on. You'd know the health of the thing, the operation of the thing, and the environment of the thing, which is pretty useful stuff to know. The second thing is you could think of moving some of the control of the thing away from the thing and back up to the cloud, where you could use a computer program or a smartphone or something like that, and you could remotely control the thing. And there's lots of reasons to do that. Safety reasons, like mining equipment that's underground is better actually not to have somebody sitting on the machine because it's dirty and dangerous. But you know, unlock your doorbell from the office when the delivery guy wants to put a package inside and so forth. So if you could control, then you could think about adding sophisticated algorithms that would try to optimize. And a good simple example I like for optimize is more and more now when I'm traveling for business, I'm in these tall skyscraper type buildings, and instead of having an up and down button, they have a keypad and you punch in what floor you want to go to. And then they figure out which elevator would be the best one to get you. So you punch in 52 and it says use elevator 3. Because elevator 3 is the best path to get to 52 floor. That's a lot better way than always have the next elevator stop. Even if it's got 10 people in it, you're going to be the 11th one and the elevator behind that's empty. Right? So they're running lots of optimization algorithms. This wind turbines here, because this particular company has algorithms that say the wake, that, you know, wind turbines create wake turbulence, and if you're in the wake turbulence of a different wind turbine, you have to operate differently, faster, slower. I don't really know how differently, but because wind's shifting around, you know, whether you're in front of the wake or affected by the wake or not affected by the wake is changing all the time. So they're always calculating that and changing it. And then finally, the last thing is this idea of autonomy, you know, which could be the Google, you know, autonomous car. Many autonomous cars are being developed right now. This particular thing is a fishbot. It's an underwater robot that swims, you know, and has to calculate on the fly currents and obstacles and stuff like that. Or, you know, what we're seeing is this big data analytics leads to machine learning. And that is machines, once they understand what sensor readings mean, they can begin to go into prediction mode, predict what's going to happen next, and then take actions to, you know, either take advantage of that or avoid that or what have you. So machine learning is a big idea right now, you know, out in our customer base and so forth. Okay, so a lot of this is based on the idea of data, that you now have a big source of data you never had before in a product. And I'm talking about in a toaster. If you want, you know, you always had data from your business systems, and you had data from other places you could get data. But what you have now is a big new source of very high volume, highly variable, unstructured data, which is sensor readings and the like. And so there's this term, you know, you probably know this, but out in the industry, people are talking about data lake. And you get a lake when you aggregate together many unstructured streams. So a massive amount of data in a raw form that's not normalized, it's not being jammed into rows and columns and database tables, because that's too hard to do and you have to throw most of it away. So very unstructured, high volume, high speed, high variety type of data. So what people want to do is take that data lake and in particular do real-time processing. So frequently, you do batch processing of history to learn the patterns and the prediction algorithms. Then you turn around and you do real-time processing of the data as it comes in going forward. We created a framework. This is part of our second paper, by the way. We created a framework that says, there's basically 4 kinds of analytics that people are doing. Descriptive analytics means, what do these sensor readings tell me is going on? Because a sensor isn't really telling you there's a problem. It's just saying, temperature, 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 temperature. So what does this set of, and by the way, you should realize how many sensors there are too. This mining equipment I was talking about from Joy Global, was a Milwaukee-based company. On one single piece of equipment, they have 7,000 sensors. So they're getting 7,000 readings a second of data. What do those 7,000 readings on that one machine actually mean? That's what descriptive analytics are. Diagnostic means, what's the problem? What's sort of the root cause? How do I go about fixing it? What's wrong? Why is that happening? Predictive analytics would be, what's going to happen next? So if I know what's going to happen next, if it's a bad thing, I'll try to intervene and keep it from happening. And then prescriptive analytics would be, tell me what to do to prevent this bad thing from happening. And that's where it gets really pretty sophisticated. So I'd say the world right now is kind of at diagnostic, moving into predictive, people dabbling with prescriptive analytics. Prescriptive analytics are much harder to do, but also much more impactful to your business. Now, if you run a service business, for example, if you're the head of the service department of a company that makes and sells and manufactures and sells things, and those things live for a long time and get service, something like predictive analytics is invaluable. That's why General Electric has this huge investment in what they call the industrial internet, which is the very same thing I'm talking about, by the way. Because the ability to fix things before they break is very, very valuable. And you not only fix them before they break, but you choose a period when they weren't being used them as well. So it's a big, powerful idea. Many other places that can be used though. Healthcare, would be a good place. Again, I know a number of companies who are trying to take those quantified cell kind of readings and say, what does that tell me about the health of this person and their risk of having different problems and so forth. Okay, now with all that data going back and forth in this architecture comes a big problem with security. There's lots and lots of vulnerabilities. I don't really have time to go into them all. But you can imagine that this is now a complex computer system, basically. I'm talking again about a refrigerator as a complex computer system. Being a little facetious there, but not totally. And so what if people could hack into that system and gain control of it, or monitor it, or worse yet, issue instructions to it, and all kinds of crazy bad things could happen. And so we kind of looked at that a little bit too, and we said it's a tough problem. The standard of care is very high here, because there's a lot at stake. If I can hack into your ERP system, I can do some damage. But if I can hack into your car when you're going 65 miles an hour down the highway and turn the steering wheel on you, I can do a lot of damage. I can kill a lot of people by hacking into that computer system. In some ways it's easier to attack because there are many more entry points and endpoints in this kind of network. And it's harder to defend because you don't have, for example, physical defenses. Most people put all their precious computer systems in a corporate data center somewhere behind lock and key. And you'll still have servers behind lock and key. But there will be a lot of other things out there in completely undefended places and incapable of even having the processing power to run the kind of software that you run typically to protect, laptops, iPads, tablets, stuff like that. So it's a tough problem. I tell people though, don't give up because we'll never solve this problem. We just have to keep fighting a good fight. I often remind people that I don't think there's anybody here who could claim that data centers are more secure now than they were 10 years ago, despite having spent billions, probably trillions of dollars on security technology. Well, why is that? Because the bad guys keep evolving fast. So there's always new threats, new responses, new threats, new responses, new threats, new responses. So I think that, like with the security, they say that for corporate America, or let's say corporations in general, there are those who know they've been hacked, penetrated, and the rest of them just don't know it yet, right? So it's a big problem out there. I think that problem will exist here too. We'll fight it, but we'll never solve this problem. And therefore, I think We'll never stop using computers. We'll keep heading down this path and fighting the good fight as we go. Okay. So then in the first paper we said, all right, given all that stuff about technology stacks and new kinds of product architectures and so forth, what would that mean for the value chain? And this is Porter's pretty famous value chain framework. If you Google on value chain, you'll find 6-7 million hits, all related back to this picture. It's a kind of old picture, but it stood the test of time. So we said, let's start with the idea that that value chain is now informed by a lot of data and analytics of that data. So by listening to the voice of the product, we can find things that are interesting for the service department, the engineering department, the sales and marketing department, and so forth. So we're going to need a group who figures out how to translate sensor readings into actionable business information and then pass that business information into these other functions. And then here are some of the impacts actually on the functions, like technology development. We're talking about much more complicated products. Again, part digital, physical, client, server, on-premise, cloud. It's really a system engineering problem because you got to sort of figure out all the moving parts and how they're all going to work together. You get a lot of data back from these products, which would help you understand how they're used and help you to make them better. I'll give you an example. We instrumented our CAD software just recently with IoT technology. It was never connected before. And customers have to opt in because they want to make sure that we're not spying on them or something. But we quickly found that 75% of the crashes of our CAD software came from 4% of the bugs. We never knew that before. So we used to do brute force, try to fix all the bugs. Now we can very quickly say, well, what really causes crashes? Oh, we can hone it down to a very small number of problems actually cause massive number of failures in the field. Let's prioritize fixing those. We didn't know that until we instrumented the software and began collecting and analyzing this type of data. There's some other ideas though. Design for evergreen. That means design a product that's always going to change. And best example I saw of that recently was Tesla announced their autopilot. And they kind of said it's not really ready, but you can buy it now and don't worry because over a series of patches, over a series of months, we're going to make it better and better and better and better and someday it'll be really good. But we're going to start selling it now because it has utility already. So we're not used to buying things that just change and change and change. I mean, we're used to that with computers, but not necessarily with automobiles or other things like tractors. Design for security and privacy. You're going to have to worry about that. Now, if when you're putting that tractor together, the engineering department putting that tractor together has to make sure that tractor is not very hackable, because if it is, there's a problem there. Design for new business models. So, there is in general, and I'll hit this a couple of times, a couple different ways, but in general, there's a business model shift happening from selling things to charging people for the use of things. Instead of buying a car and then having to own the car and park the car and fix the car and change the oil and so forth, you could just join Zipcar and use a car whenever you want. When you're not using it, walk away. It's somebody else's problem. So that's automobiles as a service. People are doing heating and cooling of this building as a service. The old model is you buy the boilers and chillers and so forth, air handlers. The new model is you just pay me to keep your building comfortable and let me figure out what needs to be done in the service scheme and so forth. I basically say that comes down to buy the sausage, don't participate in the sausage making. Get the goodness of the product without having to put up with all the badness of owning it. And people pay a premium for that. So anyway, big impacts on engineering. One of the biggest is this idea that you got to collaborate with IT. I don't know how many of you guys spend time in corporate America, but I can tell you in general, engineering departments don't like IT departments in general. There's a problem right now, which is engineering people have never built a cloud capability. They have no idea how to do fault tolerant, high performance, high availability, high security systems in the cloud. They've never done anything like that. And it's a science of its own. So now they're saying, boy, if I can't ship that tractor until the cloud part's ready, because it's a client server tractor, then I'm going to have to get the IT guys involved, but I've never seen them finish a project on time or on budget ever. And they're now on my critical path. So there's a real problem here that's scaring people. There are other places, manufacturing operations. There is, for example, in Germany in particular, a big national initiative called Industry 4.0 you may be aware of. It's really about the factory of the future, smart factories. And there's lots of stories and some of them complex, but I was recently on a panel at the Brookings Institution with the CEO of Alcoa. You know, Alcoa is making aluminum things. And he told a story where they had a factory process that kind of ran the way it ran for a long time, and they hired some young newbies who said, you have people monitoring equipment to make sure everything's going right. Couldn't you even just take a simple camera and get a video feed and then write a little software algorithm that will monitor the video feed? So they hacked together literally a cell phone based, a smartphone based system to duct tape the smartphone onto something and pointed it at the thing because it was trying to watch a slitting process to make sure it was working right. And he said that very quickly they realized that not only did they not need all these people monitoring all these machines 3 shifts a day, but they could actually run the machine so much faster because the human ability to monitor this process was actually the limiting factor. They had to slow the machines down to a speed that humans could actually monitor. But take the humans out of the loop, you speed this whole process up a lot and get a lot more productivity out of it. That was a simple example, but there are many, many such examples. There's a couple other things happening. One is that people are moving value from hardware to software. The simple example is if you think of a BlackBerry compared to a smartphone, a BlackBerry had a whole keyboard on it. Smartphone just has a piece of glass, so part count went way down. If you wanted a BlackBerry with a Japanese keyboard, that was a whole different set of parts. If you want a smartphone or an iPad or an Android phone with a Japanese keyboard, no problem. That's just a software setting and it all switches. So more and more parts that used to be hardware are being replaced by software. That's interesting because software can be changed at the last minute and thereafter. So I actually say when you think of a smartphone, not only has the part count gone down, but the final parts in the assembly are added by the consumer after they take it home. So the final step in the manufacturing process is postponed all the way into the living room of the consumer, which is a pretty interesting idea. Okay, enough on that. Logistics, so the monitoring of where things are in the supply chain, inbound and outbound sort of supply chains. I think what I would say there is, if you may know this, that the term Internet of Things actually is traced back to a guy who worked at the Auto ID lab at MIT, which was where they invented RFID, radio frequency ID technologies. So in some ways, IoT is really just the next generation hyper-sophisticated implementation of RFID. It's RFID sensors that tell you a lot more than just I'm here, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. They tell you all kinds of things and then they turn around and listen to them. But anyway, it gives people tremendous ability to locate and monitor assets and do fleet management tracking and so forth. There was a customer, we have a partnership with AT&T. AT&T sells our software because they ran out of people to sell data plans to. So now, for example, they want to sell a data plan to every one of these shipping containers. Literally. They want every one of those shipping containers to essentially have an embedded cell phone and pay the $19.99 a month or whatever. I'm sure it's less than that in volume. And then every one of those shipping containers is constantly connected to the cloud saying, here's where I am, here's the temperature, the humidity, the amount of vibration that's been happening, and so forth. And so they said they did a project to track bananas being shipped from Central America to the US. And what they actually learned was that the ship would leave Central America, go like crazy to Miami, arrive 3 days early, drop anchor. The sailors would go party in Miami for 3 days, and then when their slot opened up, they'd come into the harbor. So they actually learned that it had not, the big learning wasn't about the bananas, it was about the way the shipping company employees were sort of, misusing the assets of the shipping company. Okay, after sales service, this one's the biggest impact. So I tell people the killer app in the business-to-business world is aftermarket service, because the way we service things right now is crazy. You change your oil every 5,000 miles, whether it needs it or not. So we need to move from doing things by the schedule or by the calendar or the odometer or the hour meter to doing things when the conditions warrant them being done. And then the second thing we need to do is stop waiting for things to break. And an angry customer calls us and says, it's broken, it's down, I'm stopped. We need to start intervening long before the customer even knows there's a problem. Sneak in there at some opportune time and fix a problem that's about to happen but didn't actually happen yet. that's the big change that's happening in the world of service. There's a couple other things. One is that more and more service is happening remotely. You know, if there's software inside that thing, and it's really a software bug, or it's a hardware problem that could be addressed with a software change. You might remember the Hubble telescope, I think, was fixed to some degree with the software change, as I remember it. But another fun example there was Tesla. You know, Tesla's a good example for many of these things because they have the most connected automobile out there. But Tesla had decided at one point that, well, there had been a crash of a Tesla, and as the Tesla went over the curb or whatever, the battery case was ripped open, and there was a fire, and the car burned. The driver got out, but people in Detroit were high-fiving each other because finally they have a problem too. And Tesla said, no problem, we'll push a software patch out into our dynamic suspension that will just keep these cars up a little higher, because the statistical odds of that happening again, if we push the suspension up a couple centimeters, fall precipitously. So it was a software patch to avoid a hardware problem, and there's lots of stories like that. But anyway, the idea is you have digital proximity. So you used to have, if you sold things, like if you're Caterpillar and you sell Caterpillar equipment in every country on earth, you have to have dealers in every country on earth able to interact with those customers and those things. Maybe some or all of the service, probably not all of it in Caterpillar's case, could be done either remotely or much of it done remotely and the rest of it done by jetting people in the rare times when that has to happen. So Tesla did do this model. You know, Tesla does not have dealerships. You buy them either over the internet or you go to a store, like in Boston where I live. There's a couple of stores in different shopping malls that sell Teslas, and they're just, you know, they're right next to the, you know, all the other stores in the shopping mall, and they've got a model or two in there and a couple out in the parking lot if you want to go for a test drive. But they do direct service, and there's a couple reasons I think they can get away with that. First of all, they don't have an internal combustion engine and transmission, and that's a whole lot of complexity and problems that just go away. But the second thing is all the cars are connected, they're well instrumented. They know if there's a problem. They'll call you up and say there's a problem with your battery, and I notice that you usually don't drive the car in the afternoon, so can I show up mid-afternoon at your house and swap out the battery? You say, sure, why not? So it's a different model. Now, you can imagine the profit one generates by not sharing the profit pool with dealers who take a huge part of it. So not having dealers generates far more profit. You might argue it hurts customer satisfaction, but in the case of Tesla, they have the highest customer satisfaction in the automotive industry, so it's working pretty well. It's a good model in that case. I'm not saying it'll work everywhere, but it's interesting and disruptive. Okay, marketing and sales. I think the real thing here is if you knew everything your customer did with your product, you'd be in a much better position to engage them, to sell them new things, to sell them consumable things, to sell them replacement things, what have you. Usually a product leaves the factory and you don't know anything about it after that. In fact, next time you pull a product out of a box and it's got a registration card in it, you know why that registration card's there. Is to get some hint who bought this thing. Like what city, what state, you know, some demographic information, because companies that sell through retail don't know anything about their customers. In this new world, you turn that product on, they know everything about you, because it connects back to them and it tells them where you are and what you're doing and how you use the product and so on and so forth. This also, you know, leads to this other selling model. There's another change in the selling model. So one is product as a service. The other is related to that, but somewhat different, is subscription. You know, subscribing to the product. Even if you take possession of it, you might pay by the month rather than purchase it. And it's kind of interesting, we'll talk about that later, that puts some extra special requirements on organizations, because when people pay by the month in a subscription, like think if you buy a magazine, I mean people don't actually buy magazines anymore by the month, but you used to, probably there's other things you subscribe to. If you subscribe to something, let's say for a year, and you stop using it, and the renewal comes up, you just don't renew it, you walk away. There's no walk-away cost. There's a renewal cost, there's no walk-away cost. Whereas if I sell you a car, you feel compelled to use it because you've got tens of thousands of dollars sunk into that, a sunk cost, and you're trying to get your value out of it. And the only way you can get your value is by continuing to try to use the thing even if you don't like it, right? But if you're leasing a car and the lease is up, you just walk away. I mean, maybe car leases aren't quite the right example. that I'll show you later brings up an organizational problem. And then finally on HR organization, you know, there's big pressure on new talent, new skills, different culture. Culture is an important thing. One of the things I think General Electric's learning in their effort to become a software company is that they're too damn slow. The clock speed of software companies is so fast. And the clock speed of things that run big, expensive capital equipment factories is very, very slow. And if your product's part physical and you still need the factory, but people are going to buy it or not based on the digital merits more and more, then you're going to have to figure out how to move on the digital side as fast as a software company. And trust me, that's a lot harder for companies to adopt than you might think it is. Now, would people buy a product because of the digital stuff? Well, yeah. I mean, who would buy a car with a crappy navigation system? Nobody. I mean, I don't know about you, I wouldn't. That's one of the most compelling, you know, features and so forth. The first thing I do is get in there and look at the cockpit. And that technology is changing fast. So if you're slow, fortunately most of that comes from the supply chain, but if you were slow and you fall behind in that digital dimension, and that's where it's the key discriminator for the buying behavior, then you got a problem. So that's another issue as well. Okay, so enough about that. I reduced this discussion on industry structure down to one slide. This is another Michael Porter framework. He's got the so-called Porter 5 Forces, another very, very famous framework. Porter's 5 forces are used to analyze an industry and to determine if it's a good industry to be in or a bad industry, and if it's getting better or getting worse. So a good industry is one where there's lots of demand, lots of differentiation, everybody's growing and making money. A bad industry is a commodity industry. Like you could say laptop computers has been a very bad industry for a long time because there's very little differentiation. Tiny, tiny margins, and the price just keeps falling and falling and falling. And so behind, you know, if you go back to the Windows days, behind these companies like IBM, or I have a Lenovo here, and Dell and HP and people like that, who weren't making any money, was Microsoft, who was making tons of money. Because Microsoft wasn't competing for the operating system. They were providing a differentiated operating system through commodity hardware, and the hardware guys weren't making any money. That's an example of a bad industry. So it starts here in the middle, which is what is the nature of the rivalry amongst your competitors. Then it looks down at what is your relationship with your customers and resellers, your downstream. It looks upstream at how strong are your suppliers. And then there's a couple other factors. How hard is it for a newcomer to enter your business? And at the top, what's the threat of somebody just obliterating your business with a replacement concept? For example, cell phones have largely destroyed the camera business. Because everybody's got a camera on their cell phone. Anybody buy a camera lately? Probably not. That would be an example of a substitute product. Cell phone is a substitute for a camera. So if you go to the beginning, how does the idea of products becoming smart and connected affect rivalry between competitors? Well, there's lots of new ideas, lots of new ways to innovate and differentiate, and that's good because people that buy your product will see it as not being a commodity, it'll be special, and they'll be willing to pay a higher price for something that they perceive to be special. And you could offer other things, for example, service offerings, and even in very interesting ways. I mentioned this company, Joy Global, and we profiled them in the paper. They sell this mining equipment. They began to sell, because the equipment was becoming connected, they began to sell a benchmarking service. They said, hey, you run a mine, and you have hundreds of $1 millions of equipment, and you get, you know, so many productive hours a week out of that. How does that compare to every other mine who runs equipment like that? And so people can benchmark themselves, maybe even against an anonymous peer group, and say, we're doing something wrong. You know, everybody else is 10% more productive than we are, and being 10% less productive on $300 million worth of equipment is kind of a problem. So let's figure out what are we operationally doing wrong and try to get better and better and, you know, become average if not best in class. That they charge people for. So that's a service offering, an information-enabled service offering that follows the equipment into the mine. Okay, so how does it affect your buyers? This is mostly good. It's in the upper right here. Your relationship with your buyers generally is better. You know more about them. You have a more intimate relationship with them, and you're developing higher and higher switching costs. So, for example, once you buy a smart product and you configure it to be all just like you want, it's hard to switch. It's kind of like switching from iOS to Android. You know, it's sort of a pain. It'd be just a lot easier to buy the next unit of the one you already have set up just the way you want it. So that's kind of an idea. This product as a service business model, I said there's no sunk cost sometimes in these business models, these new business models, and that's a problem because people can escape easily. Okay, if you come downstream here to the bargaining power of the supplier, this is pretty interesting and dangerous. So for example, the automotive companies by and large hate iOS and Android. Why? Because they think they're going to be the Dell and the Lenovo and the HP of the automotive world, where you're going to say, I either want an iOS car or an Android car. Who produces the cheapest, best Android car? Because if what's most important to you is what operating system it runs, like it became for years in the PC business, then everybody producing things that runs that operating system took another step toward commoditization. So what's basically happening, if I were to sum this up, people are getting a new digital supply chain. You know, cars didn't used to run operating systems, so you didn't have that type of supplier. Now you do, and you can pick from those two, and there's a few others. These are very powerful companies. The biggest automotive companies, you probably know, make a living out of beating up suppliers, telling them that your stuff's completely interchangeable, your quality stinks, your price is too high, I'm pretty sure I'm going to switch unless you take this one last chance to give me a better deal. And the suppliers do. So it's miserable life being an automotive supplier, unless you're really unique, and not that many of them really are. So like GM, Ford, you know, anybody like that, Chrysler, Daimler, Mercedes, whatever, have been beating up their suppliers. Now imagine they turn around and try to beat up Apple or Google. Apple's the most valuable company on the planet. Google's number 3. They laugh at them. Hey, if you don't want my operating system, don't have it. I don't care. Go put that other one in there. You want something cheap? Go with cheap. Customers won't buy it because they happen to like mine. So there's a sort of a change to a digital supply chain that's got much greater power, and in some cases is looking right through you. What if Google started selling upgrades to your automobile without permission from the OEM who put Android in the automobile? Well, that kind of stuff's starting to happen. So then the automobile manufacturers say, geez, I feel again like Dell and HP and Lenovo. I'm just making a box that runs his software, and you have a relationship with his software than you do with my box. That's unfortunate. So I think I'll leave it at that. Maybe a couple quick comments. Barriers to entry, generally higher. These widgets are more complex. An entrepreneur who wants to start up a company and go compete with you has to do the digital, physical, you know, on-premise, cloud, all that stuff. Now, on the other hand, if you don't move fast enough, if you say, I don't think this will affect me, and somebody else calculates a way that it will, they can leapfrog you. And you would leave open the door to entry by not occupying a space you should occupy. And then on the threat of substitutes, to us the single biggest thing there is substitute business model. You know, if you can rent a bike, you have to buy one. If you can rent a car, you have to buy one. I would actually say that Uber, that's a classic example. Uber is an example of a new business model that tapped into a massive amount of overcapacity in the transportation system. Turns out everybody owns cars, and we hardly ever drive them, parking 23 hours a day. So next to a house, it's the second most expensive asset that consumers own. And it's the least utilized asset in the world, practically. So people say, well, maybe I wouldn't have to own a car. And some other people say, well, maybe I could take this car and join Uber and utilize it a little bit more and get a revenue stream out of it. That's sort of interesting. So they're just matching up people sitting around watching TV with a car that's parked in the driveway with people who need a ride somewhere and saying, well, I know where you are and whether or not you're free, and I know you need a ride and you're the closest one, so pow, hook the two of you together and off we go. So that's an example of a disruptive business model enabled by the Internet of Things. All right, last part. So we looked at this idea of how does this change org structures and such of companies. And this is a pretty classical organizational structure of a manufacturing business. You know, you look at what are the different things we have to do, and then where we could benefit from specialization. Let's create a functional organization. Like engineering is different than manufacturing. You have a question?
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question on your previous slide. So as you're kind of walking through that and talking through that, I was thinking this more from basic marketing principles. I mean, the first notion is obviously you have a business plan, and I'm going to assume that as you're moving forward, you actually have a legitimate business plan. But as you kind of talk through this, I looked at, what is the segments or segmentation that I want to go after? Here's the markets, here's the opportunity, making sure that I'm not really going after something that there's, 10,000 only. It's really infinite in that space. But you also talked on that whole notion of value, and that's, I think that's something that gets missed. You can create Me Too products in the marketplace, and the market will pay you for what it's worth. Music boxes, Beats, Jambox, all these guys. You go buy one today, the price is set in the marketplace, nothing disruptive. You did talk about Uber and others, and I think if you can get to that disruptive business model that has more value, therefore customers will pay you more for it. So seeking that out, or maybe even disruptive models is, obviously the utopia what you're
in fact, just on the music front, in the Boston area, we have the Bose Corporation, which is a very engineering efficient, high quality, home and automotive sound systems. And then along came this little startup called Sonos. And Sonos had inferior equipment, but digital streaming music. And Bose sales flattened out, and Sonos took off. And before you know it, Sonos was doing half a billion in revenue. And Bose had flattened out. The private company, so I don't know the exact details, but Bose was doing maybe $1.5 billion or so, and it flattened out. Bose has all kinds of religion around IoT right now. They feel like they too got trumped by this already. Now they responded as fast as they could and so forth, but now they're playing defense already, or catch up, I should say. One other thing though on the business plan thing, software now is developed with a different kind of business plan. It's this idea of agile, which is go fast, fail fast, react fast, and keep moving. Don't write a big elaborate business plan and document big elaborate requirements, because that takes a long time and chances are you're wrong anyway. So you're investing a massive amount of energy in a futile exercise. So get like a great idea and then test and evolve, test and evolve, test and evolve, test and evolve with a more agile development and just generally speaking a more agile startup type of approach. So anyway, that's another thing to think about. It doesn't affect this other than there's a lot more software involved in this world, and therefore a lot of the differentiation even in a thing company is coming from software, and they can use those type of approaches.
Well, the other thing along this too, and not to railroad your slide here, but just this thread of substitute products for services. And looking just from here, you to me, and my glasses are fairly clear. Back in the day when we were in our cars, there were paper maps and Rand McNally, everything else. If you look at an evolution really quickly, you had the paper map industry, and then you had Tom and Garmin looking at each other and saying, hey, what are these guys doing? And lo and behold, 80 months later comes, the iPhone, and taking that whole market. And see, you see how fast industry can transition. Yeah,
you're exactly right. Okay, I'll do this quickly. So we've said if you look at the classic organization, there are some new things being added. So, and maybe I'll just hit this at a high level. So first of all, companies are adding a data analytics group. It doesn't necessarily report to the CEO, but there's almost no trend as to where it does support. And that's, again, you got this massive amount of data streaming in. The analytics of it require very specialized talent, the so-called data scientists and so forth. It's expensive to store and process. You can't have every function thinking they're going to do it. The IT guys really don't necessarily know how to do this, and they don't know from a business perspective what to look for. So at least it's a specialized function of the IT group. The second thing I mentioned is design collaboration. You can't build a widget that runs half in the cloud. You can't design in the engineering department if the engineering department doesn't know how to do cloud design, and none of them do. They even know how to do embedded software design, because that's pretty simple. But when you move things out of that simple little self-contained world into big data centers, it becomes a mind-boggling, complex thing, the security problems and scalability and failover and so forth. So people are creating many different kinds of organizations to handle this. Sometimes a new organization, sometimes a cross-functional group that's half IT and half engineering. Sometimes they just nominate that IT now owns engineering for this digital part of the product and so forth. It's just a real stress point. A third thing is DevOps. You're probably familiar with that here in the computer science department. DevOps really refers to if you've got thousands of tractors or Teslas or whatever, or refrigerators connected to a common cloud, and now you need to change the software running in the cloud. And you want to change it because new features in the new model, or there's a bug or something. How do you find a time, a weekend, when nobody's going to drive their Tesla? You can't. So you're going to have to figure out a way to very carefully and quite frankly very frequently introduce small changes into running systems. Now in the world of software as a service, they figured out how to do that. So software as a service companies do this thing all the time. It's just that tractor companies don't know how to do it. But if half the tractor runs in the cloud, you better figure it out, because you have to change that cloud software, and you can't tell all the farmers, hey, sorry, your tractor's not gonna work for a weekend, because I gotta take the cloud down. And then the fourth thing is this idea of customer success management. So this is a group that tries to be proactive about monitoring the customer and their value receipt from your product. So if you sell a product to the customer, and especially if you sell them a subscription model, you should watch that customer and see if they're getting value out of it. And the reason it's especially important in a subscription model is because the walkaway cost is nothing. So if you sell, for example, in those smart tractors, the product system, it turns out actually a fair number of farmers who buy those smart tractors don't use that capability. Why not? It's too complicated. So if you sell somebody a tractor and it's got all that expensive capability and you have to renew that every year, and 9, 10, 12 months go by and they're not using it, well, shame on you. Of course they're not going to renew it. That's your problem. You should have known that. Don't wait for them to call and say I'm not going to renew it, because they don't call. I actually have a connected automobile from some 5 years ago probably, a Lexus, and they had this Lexus Link thing in it, and I never used it. And so when they mailed me a renewal thing, first year free, and so at the end of the year they mailed me the renewal slip, and I just tossed it in the trash. I said, I don't even know what it does. Didn't use it once. Nobody said, hey Jim, how come you're not using that? Can I train you, or is there a problem? So we need a different way of being very proactive. It's like customer support before they call you and realizing they probably won't call you. You need to call them and reach out to them and make sure that they're getting good value, or they won't renew it. So I think for the sake of time, these are just the same slides, a little bit more detail. So for the sake of time, I think I'll just end on this last slide. This normally would be my reporter slide, but because my reporter is a little bit headier than I am, a little bit more of the technical brains. He would say that, that these previous waves of IT growth have created great periods of economic prosperity that lasted for like a decade, and then they kind of peter out. And the internet, is sort of 15 going on 20 years old now at this point. He would argue that this is a huge opportunity for a new wave of innovation, a new wave of productivity growth, a new wave of economic growth, and that there's lots of companies that are there are lots of countries that are getting better and better at this, but that the U.S., 80% of the software in the world comes from the U.S. I mean, we invented this whole market. And if the future competitiveness of manufactured things is going to start to hinge on the software inside those things, that should be very good for the U.S. That would be his argument. Now, it turns out that the Koreans are getting pretty good and so forth, but the Japanese, for example, like, what's your favorite Japanese software company? Anybody name one? They do have software companies, but they tend to be a little bit more indigenous to Japan. I'm sorry? Yeah, okay. I mean, games, sure, yeah. I mean, I'm not saying they don't write any software, but I'm just saying it's not a national strength. Advanced manufacturing is absolutely a national strength of Japan, as it is of Germany. But that's not the discriminating factor anymore. As it shifts more and more to digital, it moves the power around, right? If labor is the deciding factor because cost is all that matters, then you end up in China and low-cost labor areas in Eastern Europe and so forth. But if it shifts, if factory automation reduces the need for labor, then people bring their factories back to the U.S. And if digital replaces much of the value of precision manufacturing, then you say, well, who's got the best digital, right? And suddenly, U.S. companies say, bring everybody back home. We're going software. There's this kind of famous quote from Jeff Immelt from GE that says, you go to bed as an industrial company, you wake up as a software company. And that's maybe a good summarizing point for what I think is happening here, is that everybody's becoming a software company at some level. And that being really good at software is critical to being a really good manufacturing company, and therefore, this should be good news for the U.S. Not to say we won't squander it, but it's at least interesting. Okay. I think I probably used all my time and then some, maybe. A question or two before we go?
Yeah, thank you very much. Time for questions. Way back. No.
Hi, great talk, very engaging.
Thank you.
So I'm interested in how people use these smart systems of systems, and particularly once you introduce control and optimization and automation, the systems become much harder to understand and predict.
Yeah.
Features sometimes interact in unexpected ways. So how can we design systems that help people understand why something is happening and what I can do to fix it if the wrong thing is happening?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, you're absolutely right, because all this software stuff is actually not necessarily easier in the end. Even something that's really easy to use, if it's one of 100 different ways to do something. You know, you get an automated home and you dream of light switches again, to be frank. So I'm not enough of an expert to say how one solves that particular problem, but I want to share a slightly different perspective on it, which is a lot of people worry about this machine learning thing getting out of control. You know, Bill Gates has spoken of it. We had Steve Wozniak, the co-founder of Apple, at our conference earlier this week, and he spoke about it. You know, we're really giving machines more and more power. And you can imagine the day of Hal, you remember that movie, 2001: A Space Odyssey or something like that, where the computers took over. You can imagine that coming back, where your car decides, no, we're not going there tonight. I'm not in the mood. I've been running my analytics, and I decided we're going somewhere else. And that's that. I locked the doors, by the way. Here we go. So, I mean, that day could happen. And so some people are saying, how are we going to guard against that? Because we're actually giving these things autonomy, you know, for the first time ever. And we're giving them not even algorithms. We're asking them to analyze data and make decisions. We're not saying if then, you know, if this happens, then do that. We're saying look at all this data, look for patterns, try to apply curve fitting, if you will, to the patterns, and then start making decisions based on that. So it becomes a little unpredictable, maybe, that's what I'm thinking. All right, I can't fix your problem, sorry.
All right, we'll get there. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, in describing your business model, I see that the consumer is actually getting more and more portion of the value chain and actually controlling more and more of the value. And also you mentioned that every country will benefit with this model. But I see that the countries are getting themselves into controlling that this is, the consumers say, I own this data, country said, I own this data.
Yeah.
How would you kind of address those incoming threats?
Yeah, well, there is a huge argument about who owns the data, and I'm not sure actually how that will resolve itself. I mean, there could at some point be government intervention, like there has been in Europe and in other places, some amount of government intervention. I think that consumers are going to start demanding control of information about them. I'll give you an example. On my iPhone here, you know, it has location services. And so, first time I got an iPhone and I realized what location services was, I turned it off. People don't need to know where I am. What do you think? What are you doing? You know? And so then I was using my phone for a while, and one day I'm driving down the road, not sure where I'm going, and I whip out Google Maps and it doesn't work because it needs location services. So then in a later release of iOS, they came out with the idea that you could selectively turn it on app by app. So some apps are on, some are off. That's the way it works now. It's pretty interesting how many apps want to know where you are, and you can't imagine why, right? So for me, I just say, hey, if I don't understand what you're going to do with this data, I'm not giving it to you. I like that model. Like, I'll give it to Google because I've determined I'm getting value back and I trust them. But I have 8 or 10 other apps that want to know where I am. And I'm saying, why? What are you going to do with it? You know, I don't want you to know where I am. I always think of Osama bin Laden turning on his satellite phone and hellfire raining down out of the sky every time you get it. You know, so, you know.
Just one comment on that. So, I mean, with all these applications that you get, in the 2-point font in page 74,
Yeah.
it basically states that you're given permission
Yeah.
to use my data.
Which is a problem, too. I would say
Read those
that
terms
whole
and conditions.
legal mumbo-jumbo 17-page click-through agreement, that has to go. Because
Thank you. Well, great talk. Essentially, I want to understand what would your best advice be to a company which has a sales force which is very good at selling these kind of commodity things, and they have been doing it very successfully for many, many years, and that has been driving their bottom lines. But now, with all the onslaught of innovative things that are coming in, just like what you spoke, and it's pretty apt on you, and they see it, but their sales force just does not know how their customers would respond, and essentially they would like to get trained on it. Essentially, what's your best advice on how to resolve?
Yeah, I mean, in software companies, we went through a very disruptive change in the way things are sold recently. You know, as people went from selling software to selling subscriptions to software and so forth, and that's a very different selling process. You know, I mean, there's consultants you can hire. Sometimes you have to change your management personnel to people who understand that new world. I'm not sure I exactly know, but you know, generally you have to paint some vision of how we're going to do it in the future and then manage everybody through the change. The question is, do you have people who understand what the future looks like? And could you bring in consultants or could you hire new people that understand the world, they've seen it before? I know it's tough, you know, as a CEO of a fairly large company, there's nothing harder to do than change a sales force, trust me. I mean, plus I'm an engineer at that, and they all look at me and say, whatever, but.
Could I have your permission to be contentious about one of the points that you had here? So I'm a huge IoT fanboy. I curate the largest Internet of Things meetup here in the Twin Cities.
Okay.
But one of the slides you put up with the points about the business models, it mentioned one of the disadvantages is disadvantage is higher fixed cost, but lower variable cost.
Yeah.
But then your example of the connected tractor, you know, I don't know if you know this because you're out in Boston now, but price of corn is pretty low.
Yeah.
And there's like a lot of farmers that are getting these bills like you get on your Lexus, and it's like.
I fed my cattle on the way. You're not going to believe it's Joe.
But they get these bills and say, oh, your connected tractor, your John Deere tractor,
Yeah.
if you want it to continue, $25,000. Otherwise, it's just a regular tractor.
Yeah. That
So
means that the subscription expired.
yeah, your subscription has expired, and you said, oh yeah, I just tossed mine in the trash. So what's with that? I mean, that's a higher variable cost that these farmers, you
Yeah,
know,
well,
and they're only making like $13,000 a year or something on corn on average.
So we can get specifically in the tractor, but let me first explain the logic behind the point. Anytime you have something that has a lot of upfront costs and then very little variable costs each time you sell one, there becomes a bad temptation to say that I can discount these things as much as necessary because there's no cost in the next unit, and the cost is already sunk. So it's like airplanes, you know, the last tickets sold are practically free. Why? Well, it's better to sell one for practically free than let the seat be empty, right? You get into this logic of discounting. The software industry, particularly before subscription, suffers this dramatically. I mean, companies like PTC sell software on a regular basis at 65% off. Mm-hmm. Why? Because we'd rather get the deal at 65% off than not get it, right? What about 70%? I got a couple customers here, I gotta be careful. But so goes the logic. I'd rather take the deal at 95% off than not get the deal, because I mean, who cares? We're at least getting some money. It doesn't cost us anything because we already made the software. That's where that thought comes from, is that the more you slide down that slippery slope.
So do you think they'll end up lowering the price when a lot of farmers get mad about it?
There's just a temptation to throw more stuff in and to discount more and so forth because the cost is already sunk and you're just trying to get all the business you can now. And what you don't realize is that you're training your customers and you're destroying the value of your product by driving the price points down, and you can never drive them back up again. That's the theory behind that one point you talked about.
I see.
In the case of John Deere, yeah, I mean, the problem, or I don't know if it's John Deere specifically, but yeah, the corn prices are terrible because the ethanol is not required anymore. And so people are saying, I'm short on money, I'm not going to renew that thing. Now, they can still use the tractor without the smarts, thank God, or else the tractor would stop working. But people aren't, I know the renewal rates right now on the smart tractors are not that high. It's the same problem I had with the Lexus. Why would I pay money for that? In my case, I didn't even know what it did. So there's probably two cases. Some farmers who liked it but can't afford it, and some of them who say, I didn't even know what it was for anyway. I mean, I grew up on a farm. These I don't want to say these people, but hyper sophisticated technical equipment in farming are, you know, not exactly yin and yang.
From Ethan, I believe you fly to Cleveland to talk to Ram Krishnan, our
Yes,
CTO.
I did, yeah,
It's a very inspiring talk. It is first time for me to participate. two very quick questions. The first one for your organization chart. Is that implemented in some company you see is successful in PTC or some of your customer?
Well, it's a couple of the ideas, particularly the customer success organization and the DevOps organization, are now widely implemented in pure software companies. So I'm arguing that as pure hardware companies become hardware software companies, they're beginning to implement that. Pure software companies don't have the mechanical, the digital, physical problem, right? And they may actually be doing the data analytics part. Can I share a story though from Eaton when I met with Ron? So he was telling me about smart hoses, which is just fascinating. You know, the idea of a hydraulic hose, you know, on an engine connecting the water pump to the engine block or whatever. That, and help me if I don't say this quite right because I'm not a hose expert, but a hose is made of many plies. And then inside that layer of plies, they put one little band of a fine mesh of electrical wires, whose gauge has been calibrated according to the pressure in the hose and so forth. Then they put a small current through that mesh, and as that hose ages, it starts to expand a little bit. And the first thing to rupture is the fine mesh of electrical wires, and you get a short. That short then has been calibrated according to the wires to say the hose is 60% dead, you know, 6 through its life, 90% through its life, whatever. I mean, so even the idea that a hose can tell you when it's going to fail is a pretty cool idea. So hopefully that was public knowledge.
Yeah, very, very big second question. I think everybody trying to go to the cloud, everybody trying to do the smart device. How you see the partition between in the value chain, like supplier, yourself, customer, everybody trying to build this overarching system, but
Yeah.
who is playing what role? It's going to be very crowded.
Yeah, I'm a software company. Remember that technology stack? I'm trying to sell the enabling technology that sits above the product. What I tell people is the first companies who do this created all themselves. Like Tesla's whole system was built by Tesla. You know, Tesla's a pretty new high-tech company out in Silicon Valley. But there's a lot of other companies who are, you know, John Deere stuff is mostly created themselves, and Caterpillar created stuff many years ago and so forth. What I tell people is be careful. Because there's a saying, and I'm not sure it's appropriate, but I'll say it anyway because it's funny, that the pioneers get the arrows and the settlers get the land. So sometimes the people who pioneer something end up failing because they get passed over by people who figure out how to do it in volume. So almost all technology, for sure in the software world, specializes by layer, ultimately. You know, there used to be the day, I used to work for a company in town here called Control Data Corporation when I was an intern, and they made chips, hard drives, mainframes, operating systems, databases, and applications. All of it. Today you buy each piece of that from a different company, and there's 10 different companies competing to be the best at every level. So my point would be, everybody can add value. You just got to be careful where. You know, if Eaton thinks they're going to build a better cloud, big data analytics architecture than anybody else, I don't think so. Maybe a better smart hose, you know, but I'm not sure about this software technology that, you know, is not really in your institutional DNA, and you'll never spend enough money, and you'll never have enough customers to normalize or to amortize the cost across and so forth.
I think we'll have 2 more questions.
Yeah, quick question on education.
Yeah.
Because you're talking about, you see a convergence between sort of computer science, software engineering work and the traditional engineering discipline. And it's a big culture clash.
Yeah.
Right. You have more of a cowboy culture in the IT side. They're very good at developing crappy software.
Yeah.
Right. And you have the engineering culture where people actually do engineering. Yeah. And you try to merge this, and there are all kinds of problems with the Internet machines and cyber physical systems. Well, what do we need to teach the computer science students to be able to contribute in this? And what do we need? How much computing do the engineering students need to know so they can at least know where the boundaries of their sort of capabilities end, then you need help so you can make this work.
I'll just say that first of all, it surprised me there aren't more people sort of with a foot in each camp as they're being educated. Again, when I did it, let me tell you the funny story about how I got here. There was I at the time IT, now CSE, unclassified, and we were in quarters, not semesters, but you could be unclassified for 5 quarters. I didn't know what I wanted to be. So there was a program where you could go visit companies, maybe still is, and talk to people about, you know, different major ideas. And I went to 3M thinking it's the greatest company in Minnesota, and I talked to an IT guy about computer science, and you'll laugh about this, this was 1982-ish. He said, I would never go, this is an IT guy, the director of IT, I would never go into computer science. I said, why not? He said, well, we've got these new things called 4GLs. And with 4GLs, computers are going to write their own software. And pretty soon, there won't be any need for computer science people. And I said, wow.
Fourth generation computer.
Yeah,
Yes.
but he's from 3M. I mean, it's the greatest company in Minnesota. So I went back and went into mechanical engineering. But then I literally did. I did on the basis of that. Now that was the single dumbest piece of advice in the history of mankind, because shortly thereafter the software industry just absolutely exploded. But when I was in mechanical engineering, I then went into computer methods or computer-aided design or whatever sub-focus. I took a lot of classes on compiler design. I mean, I was way down in assembly language and stuff like that. So coming out of graduation, I wasn't the smartest mechanical engineer, but I was the smartest computer science mechanical engineer because I had done all this stuff because that was actually my passion, right? So, but we don't train people like that. My wife is, I mentioned, bachelor's, master's, PhD from the University of Minnesota, and I always say, you know, if the car won't start, she can write the whole thermal cycle on the whiteboard, or if the lawnmower won't start, but she doesn't know how to pull the cord, right? So I think it would be good, that's not actually a perfect fit, but it would be good to have more people educated both ways. I'm not sure how to do that. You know, there's system engineering programs, but I think there's a special discipline of systems engineering, which is for ultra propeller heads. I think people need a foot in both worlds without going into the ultra specialized science of systems engineering. So, you know, just comfort with digital technology while being comfortable with mechanical technology.
Then we agree entirely. It didn't help much, but we do agree.
Well, I'm going to have to ask a question or actually comment. It's interesting with your experience, Jim. So you started off talking about hardware being made of metals, and then there's software. The thing that's making it all happen actually is electronics and communications. That side. And computer engineers and signal processors who do all the data analytics and so on are really major cogs in this wheel. So and unfortunately this building is actually joint, so it's mixing both of them together. So, well, thank you all for being here. Really appreciate it.